opportunity we have to hear from some really interesting people. My name is, for those who don't know me, I'm Mark Mann. I'm the director for the Wesleyan Center here at Point Loma. And one of the things that we've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years is bringing in summer scholars from around the country, this year from around the world. And very excited to have them here. And last year what we started doing was asking, and we've always asked the visiting summer scholars to be willing to meet with and have a conversation with PLNU faculty and staff who have overlapping interests. Somebody suggested last year that rather than this just happen on an individual basis, that we do it on a more corporate basis. So we started doing these luncheons, and wow, this is like twice the number of people we've ever had. I have a feeling it's because of the particular scholars we have speaking today and interest that a lot of you have. But welcome. So welcome to our annual Summer Scholar Series here in the Wesleyan Center. And thanks to John Calhoun and the Center for Pastoral Leadership for allowing us to use this larger space, because the Wesleyan Center couldn't accommodate that. So just a bit of introduction, and I'll let them kind of talk about themselves. So we have the kind of unusual and wonderful opportunity to hear from a husband and wife scholar team, and who have themselves overlapping scholarly interests, and I think are going to talk about some things that are going to be very interesting to both of us. First is Randall Stevens, who many of us know quite well because of his many years as a... You went to Mid-America first, right?
Yeah, I think I have the most Nazarene college experiences of anyone in the room, because I went to Mid-America first, then I went to Olivet for a year, then I went to NTS and did a master's, and then I taught at ENC. And now I'm sitting here.
You're tied with me.
You didn't do a master's at a... You only studied at one after college.
I taught it too.
Oh, okay, all right, well there you go.
Oh, of course, the one that studied it when I taught it. Never mind.
Okay.
You're ahead.
We won't...
All right. I thought for a minute.
We won't hold it against you. And actually, I hadn't met Hilda until she came, but Hilda Lothal, did I say it right? Close enough. I don't even know what, University of Oslo, or, yeah, I was a graduate of the University of Oslo. And a couple years ago when Randall was on a Fulbright in Norway, they met each other and fell in love over their common interest in American religious studies. So that must have been it.
It makes it sound more nerdy than it is. Our relationship is very nerdy.
But and I was just finding out more about this yesterday. Hilda comes from a Norwegian Protestant Lutheran background that is very similar to the Church of Nazarene in terms of its emphasis on holiness and some of the kind of counter-cultural practices and so on. She was telling me that her grandmother was aghast at the idea of playing cards and that kind of thing, which reminded me a lot of my grandmother. And so we share a lot in common. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to them. It's been really exciting to have them. Randall back for a second summer experience with us, and Hilda for the first time. And so I've been up here long enough. Let's hear what they have to say. So let's give them a welcome.
Thank you. I guess in the interest of chronology, because we both do historical work, and like our friend Ed Bloom here, American history, I'll go ahead and go first. And I have a little handout, which isn't very clever. It's just the proposal, the chapter breakdown for the current book that I'm working on, called "The Devil's Music: Christianity and Rock Since the 1950s." But first, in that interest of chronology, I'll just say something briefly, and I'll try to keep track of my time so I don't go over it. I just want to say something briefly about an article that I finished up, hopefully. I just did some revisions for a journal on 19th century American history. It was published in the UK for an article that's about the Wesleyan Methodist Church, or in the 19th century it's called the Wesleyan Methodist Connection. Close in some ways to the Church of the Nazarene, now probably considered even more conservative, I suppose. And so I was looking at this smallish denomination, which was very significant in the 1840s because it split off of the Methodists over the issue of slavery. So So the Wesleyan Methodists, this small band of believers, in the 1850s, probably numbering about 15,000, included some really radical reformers in upstate New York. So I was looking at how this denomination its trajectory over a period of 100 years, from the 1840s to the 1940s. And it fits pretty well in this model that was established in the 1970s by historians like Timothy Smith and the sociologist David Mcgovern, called the Great Reversal. This idea that evangelicals who had been heavily involved in more kind of social reform that was outward and that was in communities, whether that's women's rights or the peace movement, even vegetarianism or graham crackerism, I guess you could say, that they turned after the Civil War, especially in the 1880s, 90s. Their reform efforts, besides prohibition, turned a little bit more inward, and they focused more on kind of personal holiness and sort of maintaining the boundaries of this behavioral holiness. So I looked at the Wesleyan Methodists as a kind of test case for that. And starting in the article, I start out by pointing out the historian Donald Dayton, who comes from the Wesleyan Methodist Church, just like my family does. Dayton says that of all the holiness bodies, the Free Methodists, the Nazarenes, other groups, he thinks that the Wesleyans were the most influenced by fundamentalism in the early 20th century. So that's part of the story I'm telling, but I'm also telling the story of just how this church changed, how when it became more tied with the holiness movement in the late 19th century, a revival movement that emphasized personal piety very heavily, that also helped them kind of turn more inward. And then I end the article by looking at how they celebrated their 100th anniversary in the 1940s. And they did this in their magazine by talking about where they'd been and the story of their church. And they're it's almost as if they're embarrassed by the abolitionist legacy of their church. So they barely mention anything about it, and they say really that's what's important now is evangelism and fighting against worldliness. So that's kind of their take, their sort of official take on their collective memory. And I also ended with the story of Mcgovern, who ran for the presidency in 1972, and actually George Mcgovern was a Wesleyan Methodist, and he grew up in the northern Midwest, and he actually was on the zone of a school called Miltonvale Wesleyan College that my family went to. And when he went to university, Mcgovern he gravitated to the Methodist tradition because he felt that their social gospel sort of made more sense to him as being kind of an outward sort of facing Christian. And the irony of that is that he goes into a church that the Wesleyan Methodists first broke away from because of the Methodist Church's compromise with slavery. So sort of taking a full circle into the 20th century. So that's that, and I hope to God that the kindly people who reviewed the article, that they don't come back and say that it needs 1,000 changes. I think that would make me suicidal at this point. Okay, so should I just go ahead and move? I'll go ahead and move on to talk very briefly about
Or not so briefly.
Or not so briefly.
Very interesting.
About the devil's music, which I recently had a small fellowship with the Southern Baptist Library and Archives, which is in Tennessee, right downtown in Tennessee. And I submitted it with that title, The Devil's Music, and I immediately regretted putting the devil in the title. But they gave me the fellowship anyway, so it all worked out. Okay, so just to say a little bit about why I got interested in it. Hilda and I both have been working lately on popular music and the sort of the intersection of evangelicalism, especially, and pop music, which is really a fascinating field that hasn't been explored too much. Larry Eskridge, who was here, I think, recently, and I think Rick had him on campus, has written about the Jesus People movement and about Christian rock. David Stowe, a historian who's at Michigan State, I think, has written about Christian rock very recently in a really good book that was, I think, published with UNC. But my story came out of my research for my first book that was on Pentecostalism. And in the end of that book, this long chapter that all the reviewers said was the worst part of the book. So I decided, well, why not extend it?
Yeah.
If I'm thinking such crap, how about if I just sort of try to stretch that out? But in that last chapter, I was looking at all these 20th century sort of the impact of Pentecostals in pop culture or in politics. And in the pop cultural part, I looked at rock music, and particularly at really well-known Pentecostals or people that regularly attended Pentecostal churches, like Little Richard, who was actually an Adventist, but he also went to Pentecostal services. B.B. King, Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis Presley. Both of the latter were Assemblies of God. And of course, Jerry Lee's cousin is Jimmy Swaggart. And then, you know, there's just, the more I look, the more it's just all these first generation rock and rollers, save for certain ones, like Chuck Berry doesn't have that background. Buddy Holly is a Baptist, but quite a few of them have this kind of Pentecostal upbringing. So that was fascinating in itself. I saw some people had written about that, but they hadn't sort of pushed that theme. And I'm not saying that that sort of, you know, invented rock music, but all these sort of religious and worship innovations that inspired Pentecostalism, the kinds of services they had. I mean, the fact that they were using drums in their churches in the 1940s and 50s, both black and white Pentecostals. It's easy to see how these characters would have come out of those communities. Of course, when that becomes public, like in 1956, when Elvis says, "Yeah, I go to this Assemblies of God church," and he said he was a member, but he wasn't. He was immediately the reaction among Pentecostals was really fierce and intense. They didn't want anything to do with that. They denied that Elvis the Pelvis had anything to do with their Bible-believing church. So I look at that. That's the first chapter, and then the second chapter is I move on to the issue of race and how how evangelicals, Pentecostals, Catholics, and to a lesser extent mainline Protestants, kind of racialize rock music, and in doing that, they also introduce themes of religion. And so I'm calling this chapter "Ask Your Preacher About Jungle Music," which was the White Citizens Council, which has recently come into the news because of the Conservative Citizens Council. The White Citizens Council had these protests when Bill Haley and his Comets performed in Alabama, and they were picketing and they were holding up these signs. And one of the signs said, "Ask your preacher about jungle music." But that wasn't just a fringe sort of thing. It was, I've seen it repeatedly in Youth for Christ magazine, in Southern Baptist periodicals, all this talk about sort of jungle music, voodoo, and sort of painting rock music as this twisted kind of religion that originates in the Southern Hemisphere. Now that's fascinating, especially in 1956, because the most sort of reported story of that year in religious circles was the martyring of a group of missionaries in South America who were killed, in the same kind of rhetoric of savagery and of the jungle, sort of the dark, benighted jungle is being used. So I'm trying to make those kinds of links there. That chapter ends as believers become less and less kind of concerned with rock, because that first stage of rock, as you probably know, sort of fizzles out when Elvis Presley enters the military. Chuck Berry takes a young lady across state lines and is accused of violating the Mann Act, so basically accused of being a pimp. He goes to jail. Little Richard decides to enter the ministry, and to prove that, he's touring at the time in Australia, and he takes a bunch of fancy jewelry he has and he throws it into a river. And he says, "Ha, see, I'm serious." So it was like $10,000 worth of jewelry that he had. And then the plane crash, Buddy Holly dying, and there's just all sorts of these. So then the next one, after that, I move on to the British invasion. And this chapter on the British invasion circles around John Lennon's infamous comment about the Beatles are bigger than Jesus. And that really kind of stirring up
Keith Richards is Pentecostal?
No, Little Richard.
No. Hoping that Keith was.
But in Keith Richards' A Life, his book, he does talk about the religious thing. And he talks about Little Richard, and he says, as far as Keith is concerned, it's just a big sham. They just said they were religious to, get free dinners and have a kind of credibility or something like that. So let's see. So the thing about the Beatles, I mean, I'm Beatles obsessive, and so I was worried that like it's kind of worlds collide when you are obsessed with something and then enters your research area. You're in jeopardy of becoming almost like an antiquarian or a raconteur, where you just sort of endlessly talk about detail that no one cares about.
You got a couple people. You could talk about the Beatles a long time, and we'll be with you.
So,
and they were just taller than Jesus, right? Not really bigger than.
That's right. Yeah, didn't need size, I guess. So what I think is that this is one sort of the kind of origin stories of the modern culture wars, was this comment that Lennon made about Jesus. I did also find, it's just trivia, a minor thing, I found that maybe one of the first Beatle burnings that had publicity in America was sponsored by Jim and Tammy Faye Baker before the Bigger Than Jesus comic came out. And it was in North Carolina in 1965, and it followed, Jim gave this sermon that was called From the Rock of Ages, or From Rock and Roll to the Rock of Ages. And then they burned Beatle stuff. Okay, and then so in that chapter, then I talk about how evangelicals were kind of frightened by this growing generation gap that the Beatles kind of represent, and they've got to do something about it. Like if you read the Herald of Holiness in the late 1960s, or if you read Baptist magazines or Methodist magazines or Christianity Today, there's just a lot of hand-wringing about the generation gap and losing young people. So in the next chapter, I make the argument that that's one of the reasons why Christian rock emerges when it does. Even though it emerges, of its own accord, really, in places like San Francisco and on the coast primarily, but then spreading out through coffee shops all across the country in '67 and '68. But it's the acceptance of many people within the church of rock music as being viable as a message for Christianity. And one that really blew my mind the other day in the Herald of Holiness was none other than Chuck Milhoff. Some of you who know Chuck Milhoff know that he's to the right probably of Tim LaHaye, it seems like. But in the early 70s, he saw that this was a going concern, that this had real, that the Jesus people really had viability, and it was exciting young people. So there's this peace that's made with rock. It's not just because of what I said, it has all to do with all sorts of other things that are happening at the time, the growing number of baby boomers, etc. Then the last chapters are kind of foggy, so I really won't say much about them. Just that I'm not sure if I think I want to do more of kind of an epilogue, a shorter chapter, like an epilogue that goes from the 70s up to the present. There's so much to talk about there. And CCM becomes such a major going concern in this period. And now, I think it's something like a $1 billion a year industry. It's something outrageous, the amount of money that's made through, especially through Nash Vegas, as it's being called now. But having appeal all over the country, and also even in some places in Europe and beyond the United States. But there's also going to be a chapter following that one about making peace with rock music, where even Billy Graham lets his hair grow out a little bit, lets his sideburns grow, and then writes this book in '71 that's called The Jesus Generation, which has a cover. It looks like it's designed by somebody on LSD. So the graphics have even changed, by this point. It's sort of becoming more comfortable with the sort of the aesthetics of the counterculture and the aesthetics of the new left, if not the ideas. So then there's a chapter in between that and the epilogue, that will be about the continued resistance of fundamentalists to even Christian rock. And I had a wonderful time at Bob Jones University.
Wow, that's a weird sentence right there.
Who would ever say that? It was But they have one of the best archives in the country on fundamentalism. Just really, really good stuff. They have a whole filing cabinet that's just filled with anti-Billy Graham material, you know, because they had fights with Graham so often. So I got a lot of material there that's sort of the holdouts among fundamentalists and other evangelicals to even this concession with rock music. And I think that's fascinating in itself, and it says a lot about the kind of spectrum that's in evangelicalism and fundamentalism, ranging from one end to the other. And then I'll go ahead and stop there, because I think I've talked long enough.